Okay, good evening and welcome again. We're going to go ahead and get started because I know we have a lot of questions that are already waiting our panelists. Welcome to the discussion on charting a path forward in education. A few quick logistical notes before we do get started. Please note that participants will not be able to speak or turn their video on, but we encourage your questions. Please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask them, and we'll get through as many as we can. Please also interact with us on social media using the hashtag ElectionEd2020. For those of you joining us on Facebook Live, please also feel free to share your questions there using this hashtag, and we'll pull from there as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to get us started and to lead tonight's discussion. Over to you, Javed.
Thank you, Patrick, and good evening and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for what we think will prove to be an exciting discussion around what the future has in store for education in the United States. Before we get started, I would like to send a special thanks of gratitude to our partners in this endeavor, AASA, the School Administrators Association, the National Association of Elementary School Principals, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, the National Association of State Boards of Education, and lastly, the National School Boards Association. We very much appreciate your partnership in this endeavor. It has been a crazy year filled with a global pandemic, social unrest, and a presidential campaign. But we now know who will be sworn in as the President of the United States on January 20th, 2021. What we don't know, however, is exactly what this will mean for education in the United States. We have an idea about the President-elect's education priorities, namely that they will diverge significantly from that of the current administration. It is yet to be seen, though, how this will unfold and what it will mean for our districts and our schools who must implement these priorities. And we could think of no better panelists to delve into these issues than those who led this work at the federal level and those who are currently engaged in leading this work on the ground in their communities. With that, I'm honored to welcome our panelists, Secretary Margaret Spellings, Secretary Arne Duncan, Chancellor Carranza from New York City, and Superintendent Carvalho from Miami-Dade County. To get our conversation started, I will offer each of our esteemed guests an opportunity to make brief opening remarks. First, Secretary Margaret Spellings served as U.S. Secretary of Education under President George Bush from 2005 to 2009, and is currently the President and CEO of Texas 2036. We're thrilled to have her here today. Margaret, welcome, and I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Javed, and thank you to all the sponsors of the event tonight. It's a who's who of education policy. And of course, I want to thank and recognize my fellow panelists, my good buddy, Arne Duncan, whom I see almost every day now doing things like this, and those of you who are working so hard in the field during these incredibly challenging days. So as I reflect on the way ahead in federal policy, I'm harkened back, honestly, to 2000 when we had not as dramatic, but pretty dramatic, shortened transition period. And likewise, needed to bring the country together. And as I think many of you know, certainly Governor Hunt knew, having worked with then Governor Bush on education reform at the state level, we knew that that's an area that we could come together. And it was not an accident that we started the administration, literally the first week in office, with a preview of No Child Left Behind, having Senator Kennedy, Senator Gregg, the Big Four, George Miller, et cetera, over to the White House and began the process of working on No Child Left Behind together. And I tell you that story because I do think that education is a place where we can come together, and certainly there are urgent needs. So when I think about that short list of things that I'm worried about and hope that we'll see federal action on, I think about broadband ubiquity and the resources that we need to go with that. I think about just plain old support for state and local governments who are under serious financial strain, and certainly the Biden-Harris platform calls for additional federal resources. I think about a focus on educational loss at all levels, particularly though with our early learners and our pre-K students. So learning loss and maybe mounting a national tutoring intervention or the like. And I think about recovering those 3 million or so students that were enrolled in school last spring and are no longer there on the rolls today. So a few highlights. The last thing I would say is we know that as the COVID is so linked to our economic recovery, that those alignments between our schools and workforce are critical. And so I think that will put high schools in sight, and those pathways, the kind of the words we EduWonks use around those things. But that's my short list. On the difference with the Trump administration, clearly I think charter schools will be out of fashion. And there's a lot of support, of course, in the union community for those changes. But anyway, as I look in my crystal ball, that's what I see. But I do think we'll all be busy, because I pray and I hope that education will be a place where we'll have bipartisan agreement.
Thank you, Secretary, for those remarks. Next, Secretary Arne Duncan, who served as the U.S. Secretary of Education under President Barack Obama from 2009 to 2015, and is currently managing partner for the Emerson Collective. Arne, it's great to have you with us tonight. I'll welcome your opening remarks.
I'll be very quick. And I think what Margaret laid out would just be an extraordinary agenda. And if the next administration, bipartisan way, could get some of those things done together, that'd be a huge, huge step in the right direction. And I'll just echo what she said, that for me, this is, there's nothing ever political or partisan about education, or shouldn't be. We can have legitimate differences of opinion, but there's nothing Republican or Democrat about more kids in pre-K or raising graduation rates or making college more accessible and affordable. If we could agree on some of those goals as a country, that would be amazing. But I really worry not just about education and education policy, but about how we stitch our country back together, or try to. The level of divisiveness, obviously, now is, I think, stunning. And there are not too many better places than education to try and come together across geographies, across political differences, or whatever it might be. We all have kids. We all want the best for our kids. We all want the best for our communities. We all want the best for our country. So if we want to try and stitch our country a little bit better together, I can't think of a better place to do it than in education. And this is the final thing to all the superintendents and principals and teachers watching this. I just want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership. This has been such a challenging, difficult, I'll even say dark time. And just what you guys have done to take care of kids, take care of your staffs, take care of your community, to feed children, to take care of their social and emotional health, to do the best you could educationally, to take care of your own families during a time of real uncertainty. It's truly beyond inspiring. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. With that said, I'll turn it over for welcoming remarks from Chancellor Richard Carranza.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all the sponsors as well, and the secretaries, and my good friend Superintendent Carvalho for being on this panel as well. I want to echo what both of our former secretaries of education have said. I would only say this. We are facing 3 pandemics. One is a viral pandemic called COVID-19, which has exacerbated the inequities in our school systems, in our communities, that are decades, in some cases generations old. They have been disproportionately impacted. But attendant to that viral pandemic is the economic pandemic, which has devastated our school budgets, our district budgets, our state budgets. And then the third pandemic is the long-awaited reckoning of racial inequity and systemic racism that all of us have been tackling for many, many years. There are 3 pandemics that I am very hopeful this new administration will embrace as a path and as a target going forward. So I totally agree that this is an opportunity for an educational new deal, if you will. Imagine the new normal post-COVID-19 being completely different from the pre-COVID-19 normal. And what will that look like? It'll look like we're dismantling systems of oppression in our schools by how students are admitted to schools, how students are selected, the opportunities they get. We will have truly bridged the technological and the connectivity divide. We will have invested in public schools not as an expense, but as an investment in the future. And think about how powerful it could be if we were able to leverage the wherewithal of our students, of our teachers, of our administrators, and move from punitive evaluation systems to truly formative systems that really promote best practices and better pedagogy. The last thing that I'll say is I'd like for you to do two things, everyone that's listening, two very important things. Primeramente, quiero que saquen un lápiz y un papel. Quiero que escriban tres cosas que ustedes quisieran que el presidente de los Estados Unidos hicieran y quiero que por favor lo apunten en el chat. Now, for some of you, I'm not trying to be rude, but for some of you that don't speak Spanish, welcome to the experience today of English language learner students across the country. And think about the fact that just because you may not have understood what I just said in Spanish, doesn't mean you're less intellectually capable, doesn't mean that you're less intellectually curious. It doesn't mean that you don't value your education, you just don't know the language of instruction. And you couldn't complete the task that I asked you to complete. I want us to be that grounded in our federal policy around the students and our most vulnerable students and our most vulnerable communities so that we don't forget them and what they're experiencing every single day. I'm incredibly optimistic, but I'm incredibly realistic about we can't let our foot off of the gas pedal to do right by our children.
Thank you, Chancellor. And finally, I'd like to welcome Superintendent Carvalho to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to say hello to my fellow panelists, secretaries, and my good friend Richard Carranza, as well as every single administrator and teacher, parent and student across America. I think Richard said it wisely, and it's something I often say is that the two things. Number one, what began as a health crisis quickly became enveloped in a social racial issue in America that will usher in probably one of the worst economic recessions of our time that could dramatically injure public education. But we need to recognize that prior to the COVID crisis and its impact on children, we had literally millions of children already in crisis. And it was those in crisis to begin with that have descended into a lower level of crisis now. So I certainly am the eternal hopeful, and my hope for the incoming administration, based on their commitments of supporting educators by giving them the pay and the dignity that they deserve, by investing resources in schools and students to grow physically, educationally, psychologically, emotionally into the healthy adults we hope they will be, and allowing educators to focus on teaching, not just test preparation or the accountability road that they're often forced on, albeit important. Certainly ensuring that no child's future is determined by the zip code of birth. And I think that we all say that, but sadly, in many cases, that is still the case across America. Providing every single middle and senior high school student with a specific path that makes them viable and successful in the workplace, in society of today. And all important, considering the opportunity gaps that many of our kids fall into right from birth, those opportunity gaps that become academic gaps, that then become lifelong economic gaps. Let's make sure that, in fact, the promise of this new administration of investing heavily in early childhood education, high quality, childhood education that begins not with kindergarten or pre-K, but begins at birth. So in addition to that, I hope that the administration will enable districts like ours to do more with the resources we need to find those missing kids, those unengaged kids across America today, who since the pandemic have disengaged or never connected. Lastly, it is time for us to have a rapid regression to educational reasonableness in this country. And that does not mean just funding. And funding is important. We are hopeful that another stimulus package arrives soon, if in fact we are to avoid the abyss that we all know will come at us. But also reviving topics that may be uncomfortable to some, but indispensable in today's America. Civil rights issues, as Richard talked about. We need to reverse some of the pronouncements that have attempted to push some kids back into dark corners that should not exist in today's America. So it's about policy, it's about investments, about bringing dignity back to a lot of our kids, a lot of educational institutions. It's about having a concrete plan that leaves literally no one behind.
Well, thank you, Superintendent. So now we're going to jump into some questions. We've been compiling questions from our partners and from the field in advance of this webinar. And we'll obviously have questions coming in as we speak. I'd like to go to our two secretaries to start with. President-elect Biden's campaign platform is a stark departure from the Department of Education under President Trump. In it, the president-elect called for dramatically increasing federal investments in education, including an ambitious call to triple Title I funding, and also reinstating Obama-era civil rights guidance. What challenges and opportunities exist for the Biden administration in acting on these priorities? Secretary Spellings, we'll start with you.
Well, I think the understatement of the year is what you said about how different this will be from the Trump administration. I mean, for starters, there'll be a focus on education. And I was privileged, as Arne was, to work for a boss who thought there was a federal role, that it was an appropriate platform to bring us together, and that we needed to remember our history of the federal role in education, which is around civil rights, which emerged from the Great Society and has always been about equity. And of course, that's in part about resources. It's in part about policy, like Title IX and like the civil rights guidance and on and on. So I think we are coming out of a place where it was almost a rounding error, or really not a priority, into a place where it will be a big priority. I'm very encouraged by that. So yeah, I think there'll be resources are going to be constrained, folks, everywhere, and so we in education need to go and get our fair share. I think we need to make the case that there is no economic recovery, there is no COVID recovery without attending to the needs of our students. And if there is one hard lesson from COVID, I think people have learned that our country, our families, our economy doesn't function without our schools. And so resources, policy changes, yes, but I am looking for that bipartisanship and getting things done. I also hope that we will not reopen anytime soon the Pandora's box that is a reauthorization, because our schools need certainty right now.
Secretary Duncan, would love your thoughts here.
Okay, just to echo Margaret, how the current administration walked away from civil rights on the education side was one of the most devastating things that I saw. Again, I always speak honestly, personally from the heart. People may agree or disagree, but for me, they always consistently chose the powerful over the powerless, and chose to support the wealthy and not the vulnerable. And I don't say this lightly. I often think for them, cruelty was the point. It was not an accident. It was not happenstance. It was literally the point. And that's a heartbreaking reality. And to see, the next administration reverse that, and reverse that as vehemently and vociferously as they can, and start to fight for the most vulnerable, as the federal government always has and always should and always must, whether it's in school integration, whether it's children with special needs finally having the chance to go to school, whatever it might be, whether it's trying to protect women and men from sexual assault on campus. That's the role. That's sort of why you're there. And so returning to those roots can't happen fast enough. And again, lots of talk about who's gonna be secretary, that's fine, but who's gonna lead the Office of Civil Rights? That's a big, big job. And I want to focus on that, how we rebuild the career staff that's been decimated, just too many amazing career staff walking away, and just heartbreaking loss of talent and wisdom and expertise. And so there's gonna be a lot of rebuilding that's gonna happen there. A tripling of Title I funding, that would be, amazing. Is that realistic? I don't know if that's realistic. We'll see what happens in Congress and in Georgia. I'll say if there isn't a Democratic control of the Senate, that's not gonna come close to happening. And so we have to really, as Margaret said, do what we can on the funding side. There's a desperate need for more resources. Again, the fact that the current administration pushed people to go back to school and provided no money to do that safely just showed how dispensable and disposable kids and teachers and principals were. And so if we value our kids' health and safety and that of our teachers and our principals, we have to make our schools safe before they go back. And then the final thing, just to, for us all to really think about and have some hard conversations going forward, there's a huge acknowledgement about the racial injustice and the systemic racism that's, didn't start with the current administration, started 400 years ago. But I think there'd be some healthy debate about how you really fix that and what you change to do that. And what sacred cows are you willing to maybe challenge a bit to actually do the right thing for the kids that we say we care most about? Kids of color, English language learners, kids below the poverty line, immigrants, children with special needs. And I think that there needs to be some healthy conversation and dialogue, not based on our political ideologies, our political beliefs, but based on evidence, based on data. What's really making a difference for those kids in those communities? And if we're not willing to have some courage and do some things differently now, shame on us. It'll be a massive, massive lost opportunity.
Thanks so much. So with thinking about these federal policies, we don't always think about how these policies potentially impact, direct impact they have on this, our local context. So, Chancellor Carranza, from your perspective in New York City, what challenges or opportunities may come with implementing these policy priorities on the ground?
Yeah, so I think our secretaries of education are just right on the money, just right on point. You cannot have an economic recovery if you don't have an educational recovery. And I think it's a matter of perspective. I mean, if we continue to view funding for public schools as an expense rather than as an investment, then you're going to continue to have these disproportionate impacts on communities. And in New York City, where 82% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch, 80% of our students are either Black, Latino, or Asian. And a full 56% of our students are immigrants. Then that's America. And if we are not paying attention to who we're educating and investing in making sure that those students have a pathway to success. Superintendent Carvalho said it beautifully. Early education, there is no question, there is no argument. The jury is in. Early education, high quality early education is a game changer for children. So we need to be making investments in the very future of where we go in America. But I want to tell you one story from New York that I think summarizes what we've been talking about. So when we pivoted in March to remote learning, New York City was literally the epicenter of community spread in America. It was a scary time in New York City. And when we pivoted, all during that time, we fought hard to come back and suppress community spread so that we could have a semblance of in-person learning. September 21st, we opened for in-person learning. And by October 1st, we had all grade levels. For families that wanted to have early in-person learning, they had the opportunity. A principal came to me in early October and said to me, and she was an elementary school principal, she said, we just saw this student. I'm not going to mention her name for privacy reasons, but she's a Bengali student and her parents are immigrants. And she said, we lost her from March until September. We lost her. She didn't log on. She wasn't connected. We never saw her. We actually, in May, when we actually could come off of pause and go and make house visits, we tried to find her. We couldn't find her. But on the day that we opened up in-person learning, she showed up. And this principal said to me, it's not because she wasn't interested in education. It's because when we asked parents, do you need a device? Do you need a computer? Her parents were so scared to put their names on a list because they didn't know who was going to see that list. And it was around the same time that ICE agents were identifying themselves as NYPD in New York City. So they didn't know who they could trust. And a few weeks later, both of her parents lost their jobs. And very, very soon after that, they were evicted from their apartments. So they were literally couch surfing until September when we came back to in-person learning. And they happened to hear that we were back in business, we were opening our schools, and she came to school and they reconnected with her. So there is not only the technical issues of funding and Title I and technology, but the game changer here is the change in the rhetoric. the change in what our families are hearing every single day around who they are and what they are. And for us, I think that is a golden opportunity to reconnect with our community and our families and have the investment, not the expense, the investment in making sure that our children are able to be successful and make up the ground that they've lost over these last 9 and hopefully not many more months.
Superintendent Carvalho, how are things on the ground in, from your perspective in Miami?
And mute myself. I heard Richard talk about how New York City was the epicenter of our country. And then like everything else in New York, at some point, it comes to Miami. And Miami became the epicenter, the COVID-19 epicenter of America. Yeah, but look, much like New York, we certainly at the appropriate time pivoted to online learning. It was the right thing to do. At some point, obviously, we pivoted back to the schoolhouse model, affording parents an option. I do believe in choice, reasonable, appropriate, rational choice. And things are going reasonably well. With that said, there are opportunities and challenges moving forward, particularly as a nation inaugurates a new administration. And I want to go back a little bit to what Secretary Duncan said, because I think it cannot be lost to any one of us. And I think that President-elect Biden has committed time and time again to expanding the Department's Office for Civil Rights. We need to bring back grants for voluntary school integration. We need to reinstate guidance that was decommissioned, sadly, that has either rewritten or rescinded protections on issues like transgender student rights, sexual assault in schools, racial disparities in school discipline. So that is a body of work that I believe needs to be not rushed, but considered in an expedited way. Secondly, the funding opportunities with a new administration. I'm not sure if it is feasible, considering the makeup of today's Congress, to triple Title I investments, but certainly an increase in Title I investment would be important, as would be a significant increase in IDEA funding, which is still falling short of the 40% guarantee in average spending, with a growing students with disabilities community growing across America. But I would like to make one point. I think the last 8 to 9 months have taught us all one thing. The rules of the past stopped applying. We had to re-envision and reinvent ourselves in a very, very dramatic way with no time, virtually no time to prepare for it. But now we have 8, 9 months of experience of doing things in a different way. So I hope, if nothing else, out of this crisis, we are much better at managing the healthcare needs of our children and their parents through a school-side delivery system and community delivery system. I hope we are much better at delivering effective instruction anytime, anywhere for children in our community. I hope we are much better when children are sick of providing a continuity of instruction when there are natural disasters such as hurricanes, that learning does not stop. I hope we've learned that connectivity is not a privilege, but it must be an American right for every single child in our country. Access to technology, access to adaptive ways of learning that are personalized, individualized for all students. And if we do not learn from the last 9 months and recognize from a policy perspective that some things do need to change, such as the requirements associated with E-rate, that they are old and no longer in line with the needs of students, teachers, and systems today. The requirements for mandated seat time, which are in many instances arresting a children's potential. So I hope that the administration pays close attention to what both secretaries referenced were the racial inequalities. They are often described by zip code of birth. The inequalities associated, the inequities associated with students who speak other languages, immigrant students. But beyond that, also recognize the policy changes that need to take place in light of this crisis and our learning to make education not just 21st century, but actually an education in this country that meets every single child where they are. We were forced to do it. And if we do not really leverage the pain of the last 8 months into a new opportunity to re-envision, reinvent American public education, then we miss something.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. We've had a lot of great questions come in already. I'd like to remind our audience that there's a question and answer feature on the bottom of the Zoom app. So please make sure you push your questions forward. The Biden administration has already signaled that the response to COVID is going to be a top priority. The transition task force already launched. I'll ask our secretaries first. What do you think the role of the federal government with the Biden administration in supporting, what is it going to look like in supporting states and districts as they develop or continue to develop their response to COVID-19? Secretary Duncan, we'll start with you this time.
Well, yeah, that has to be the biggest response for the country. That's the existential crisis we're facing. So there's no choice there. Obviously, not just president, president-elect, the vice president. Ron Klain was an amazing partner, doing this stuff when we were in DC together. But the pandemic doesn't know red or blue. It doesn't know states. It doesn't know geography. It's hitting all of us, including, quite frankly, my family right now. And it's a scary thing. It's not something I wish on my worst enemy. And you have to have a national response. So having a team of amazingly of doctors, scientists actually leading this effort, it's a pretty good place to start. Having an education secretary tied at the hip to the head of HHS, tied at the hip to CDC, and having clear guidance, having absolute transparency, learning together, openly and being vulnerable. And we're a lot smarter, as you heard others folks say, than we were 9 months ago, but we're gonna be a lot smarter a month from now than we are today. And as a country, we're in a much worse place than we've ever been right now. We got to be honest about that. But what you will see is an administration that won't do this perfectly, but I promise you'll make mistakes, but they will do it with amazing humility and urgency and honesty and transparency. And we will finally, I hope, start to turn the corner on what started as a natural disaster and unfortunately morphed into a man-made catastrophe.
Secretary Spelling, do you have any thoughts on the federal role here?
Yes, I think, as President-elect Biden has rightly said, we've got to confront the pandemic immediately. And my hope will be that education is a big part of that. We've got to get on the first train out of Washington, because if we're going to come back to education later, then we get, it will not be the priority that it must be. And so I think we need to spring into action, all of us, kind of immediately, that there is no COVID recovery, et cetera. Now, when you think about things like vaccine distribution and making the case that people and families need to take vaccines, just as people look to us in education for meals, for mental health support, for domestic abuse and child abuse and all of that. I think our schools are going to be called on to be a part of the response around vaccines. So we got to be on that first train out. Secondly, as I like to say, and we certainly have seen, we're never going to have better government than we have the people in it. And so we need to hope and pray that great people like Arne Duncan and Ron Klain, whom we got to know well in Dallas, Texas, in his role in Ebola, suit up and work daily and diligently to get us out of where we are now. And I want to echo Alberto's comments about, we can't go back to normal. We got to catapult to the way ahead. And this can be an incredible opportunity to do that. We've shown how important our schools are, and we've shown that we can adapt. And with resources and a commitment and high expectations for every child and getting on the first train out of DC, we can do it.
Superintendent Carvalho, in the schools and districts, as you know, have been working within, and in some ways in the absence of federal policy around COVID-19. Where do you see the federal role being most impactful for your community?
Well, I see the role of federal government as being effectively impactful in any community to the extent that it is science-driven, to the extent that it is guided by medical and public health minds, to the extent that it prioritizes people, not politics, and to the extent that provides, quite frankly, the appropriate recommendations and guardrails for the nation. And that includes school systems. That includes the guidelines on school closures, school reopenings, protocols that are based in science. But also, there's a role beyond the policy and the technical assistance. And by the way, I have to say, I think we're in good hands right off the bat, because one of my advisors for the reopening of schools in a safe way in Miami has been tapped as part of the task force for President-elect Biden, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was President Obama's Surgeon General of the United States of America. He happens to be a graduate of Miami-Dade County Public Schools, so that positions him very well right off the bat. But I think he has a lot to say. And in addition to the policy and the guidance, I do think, respectful of the state's rights, that there's an opportunity for, in the next, no matter what, in the next level of stimulus earmarks in our country, which are absolutely necessary. And I have to say that we are on the verge of an economic recession that may surpass the 2008-2009, but comparatively speaking, we are working with about 1/10 the federal investment that had been made already at that time. Part of that investment, future investment in a second appropriation of a stimulus package, needs to include additional funding, not just for the protection of K-12 education across the country and post-secondary education, but also investments in school-based health, telemedicine, community-based health in partnership with school systems, effective dissemination of test kits through schools, through appropriate entities. That requires that every single school have a nurse on site. That's not the reality in America right now. But if in fact we want to contain this in an appropriate way, we need to listen to science. We need to fill those positions with people who are medically trained, who are public health experts, and develop and print policy for the country, guidelines for the country that are not ever changing and reflect the best practices we know exist. And then the appropriate funding for creating educational and health realities, both physical as well as psychological and mental health in every single school. And that requires funding and the appropriate personnel to implement it.
Thank you for that thoughtful response. I intentionally waited for Chancellor Carranza to come in last on this question, because as we all know, the pandemic took a significant toll on your city. So we all, as Americans across the country, are very grateful for your governor, all the way down to local leaders, and very thankful for your leadership. What do you see the role of the Department of Education under the Biden administration, specifically around COVID-19? How do you see that?
Yeah, so thank you. I just want to add my voice to the quartet that we have here, because I'm not going to disagree with anything that Margaret, Arne, or Alberto has said. Absolutely, amen, yes. But I would say, look, I want the federal government to believe in science, not science fiction. And that in and of itself will give us, the practitioners in the field, the superintendents, the principals, those of us leading in a local level, some level of continuity and some level of unity in being able to enact policies that are based on the science and the public good. Now, that being said, I think it's also incredibly important that we recognize that, notwithstanding the individuality of every circumstance, I mean, the only reason we in New York City we're able to come back to we're the only school system of the 25 largest school systems in America that on September 21st had some semblance of in-person learning. But I will tell you this, had I been with the same indicators that my friend Alberto had in Miami-Dade, I would have been in the same place that Alberto was. There's no way I'm bringing in-person learning back. Our community spread is too high. Now, why is it incumbent upon Alberto to take on the governor, take on the other federal officials and say, because of the health and safety of my children, I'm going to take a stand, right? That should not be how we do public policy in the United States of America. We were fortunate in New York City that we had a public spread, a community spread that was under 1%, which allowed us to have in-person learning. Even to this day, where like everyone else in America, our community spread over a 7-day rolling period is inching up. Right now, our community spread is 0.01%, which is lower than the city's community spread. So I can effectively, honestly, and with credibility say to everyone, the safest place in New York City is in one of our public schools. Why? Because we require the wearing of face masks, because we require hand washing and disinfecting, because we disinfect continuously the entire time school's in session, then we do a deep cleaning at night, because we've checked our ventilation, and because we have appropriate PPE for everyone in our schools. Because we've done that, it's allowed our children, especially our most vulnerable children, to have that special relationship with a well-trained, caring teacher, providing instruction to them in person, adhering to all of the medically advised protocols to keep our students and staff safe. Now, that's incredibly important. I would just ask us, imagine if our federal agencies, the Department of Education, starting with the presidency, was saying, wear your face mask, wash your hands, social distance, disinfect. Can you imagine the impact that that would have in terms of a national message? It wouldn't be up to Alberto and I to enforce that, sometimes upstream to what the rhetoric is in our states, but rather to say we're reinforcing what the message is based on the science, not the science fiction. That's what my hope is for this new messaging from the federal government.
Thanks for that. I'm going to pivot a little bit. We have a good question in from our dear friend Ellen Galinsky and Barnett Berry. Both happen to be asking about the science of learning. What have we learned from the pandemic about how children learn best, and what does that mean for the future of teaching and learning? I'll throw this one to Superintendent Carvalho first.
Well, I can tell you one thing. I think that's a profoundly important question, one that we're wrestling with across the country. What we've learned is this: those kids were in crisis before COVID-19 as a result of a disrupted fourth quarter of last year, which was then compounded by the typical summer regression, which impacts poor children, fragile children, students, English language learners, the foster child, the homeless child, more dramatically than others. And then compound that with a beginning of this school year, which was still, in many cases across the country, online. And I'm a big proponent of technology, but technology cannot be viewed as a replacement for actual teaching and learning. And I think we've learned that, more evidence of that this time around. For the disengaged child, for the child who is living in poverty, who has a parent or two parents who have to go to work, and they're depending on that child because he or she is a teenager to care for the 3-year-old at home. That child online is not going to learn. So technology is great to the extent that it is personalized and adaptive, and there's equity in terms of it, children having access to it with connectivity and a device. That's the easy stuff. The difficult element is that which is often very difficult to replace outside of school. That means someone who becomes your mentor, your coach, your tutor, the person who urges you to continue, the person who's monitoring your work constantly, the person who ensures that you have an environment around you that allows for you to learn rather than distraction all the time, the person who ensures that you're eating regularly. And sadly, in many instances, the gaps a lot of our kids have fallen into for generations have been exacerbated due to this crisis. So we have learned that a lot of the systems, we as a country, I believe, took a little bit of time, but we caught up faster with the technological needs of students, specific to device, connectivity, access to Wi-Fi, than we have done in terms of providing the social, affective, mental, psychological support for children who are learning online but regressing with each day that they are online and not in school. And I think we do need to do a much better job at really addressing that. It is very difficult to provide a one-on-one paraprofessional support for a disabled child whose IEP requires more than that online. But across the country, we have seen kindergartners disappear. Pre-K enrollment is extremely low. And we know for a fact that the most fragile populations in America, because our systems were not prepared for that. We are learning as we're going, we're getting better, but we have missed the mark in providing all of what every single child is entitled to, whether it is a full realization of a child's IEP or to mitigate the regression of a third grader who is struggling to read at grade level to begin with. And I think that's where we need to put a lot of our investment. We put a lot of investment, literally, in necessarily so in technology and connectivity. We need to make an equal investment in the effective and social support for kids, whether they are in school or they're learning online.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna, sake of getting through the ton of audience questions we're getting, I'm gonna try to proceed when getting more questions in and limiting our input from one of you at a time, except for this question, because I think this one warrants a response from both secretaries. Ann Flynn is asking, and I asked this question on behalf of having been a local school board leader, and thankfully somebody blessed me that I'm not on a school board now in this moment, in these times. But given the deep political divides across the nation, do you have suggestions for local school board members and superintendents who are faced with needing to heal those local community tensions from this extremely divisive election? Secretary Spellings and then Duncan.
Well, that is the $64,000 question for sure. But I think, we have to, and I think most people are starving for this. We have to go back to first principles, to the things that unite us, to our belief that education is what distinguishes us from other nations. Education is what has made and will make a difference in everyone's life, a commitment to equity and achievement for all. And I think you cannot say it enough. I loved, Richard, what you said about science and science fiction, that we reinforce that over and over and over. And so I think that consistency of message and that aspiration for what we can and must do together, I think is just first principles, and people are starving to hear it at every level, from the president all the way down to a local school board.
I think that's exactly right. And I'm not a big, sing kumbaya guy. I'm sort of a guy let's do some work together, and through some sweat, that's how we start to build some common ground. But you sort of think about the issues we've talked about at the local level, everywhere. What if you made a commitment to go find every lost child? And it wasn't just the school system, it was the churches, it was the nonprofits, it was the social service agencies. What if you just decided together you're gonna go find every lost child? What if you decided to try and do a massive campaign to enroll those 3 and 4-year-olds in pre-K if you have it, and bring them back in? What if you made a commitment that you're going to figure out which kids need 1 meal a day and which kids need 2 meals a day and which kids need 3 meals a day, and you're just very public and transparent about meeting that need, whether it's food pantries helping out, schools, whatever it might be. What if you made a commitment to say these many kids need the social and emotional help that Alberto talked about? It's not just the school system, but it's the public health clinics, and it's the private, universities and hospitals helping out. I mean, I could go on, but there's a series of 4 or 5 urgent, critical things that the schools can be the catalyst for, but they can engage the entire community working together. And all of those challenges face kids across the political divide. Again, that's irrelevant. And so doing some real hard work together and holding yourselves accountable and moving forward in those areas, I can't think of a better way to try and start to heal some of those divisions. And then the final thing is just like the travesty in the pandemic is you have 15,000 school superintendents, very few of whom are public health experts, trying to figure this out by themselves. But so as we engage in these activities, you're going to have basically, again, every school superintendent working on this stuff. Can we learn together? Can we figure out best practices, how to find these kids, what's working, and share that information together? And again, I think the U.S. Department of Education can be a great convener and conveyor of that kind of information. I honestly can't think of a better place than schools and vulnerable kids and all of us coming together on their behalf to try and stitch our democracy back together again.
Thank you for that. Superintendent or Chancellor Carranza, pardon me. With the current economic crisis and the trauma the country has been through, our youngest learners are being significantly impacted during an extremely important time for their development. What do you think it's going to take for pre-K, 4K, 3K to become universal to support our youngest learners?
Yeah, so the jury is in. We absolutely have conclusive information that tells us that pre-K, 3K is not only impactful, it's a game changer for our youngest learners and especially our most historically disenfranchised learners. I can share with you that in New York City, a third-party review showed that our pre-K, universal pre-K program actually showed a closing of the opportunity gap for our African-American Latino students. This is pre-COVID, of course, in a very significant way. So if the evidence is there, why aren't we investing in the best practices? So I would say that an investment in early education, high quality early education, is not only important, it's fundamental to how we are able to move our students forward post-COVID-19. And when you add the facet of COVID-19, it's, I would say, without a question, insurmountable. You cannot make those gains without investing in that early education. So it's going to be critical to us. Now, from the educational perspective, and I'm a teacher, I put my teacher hat on, I put my principal hat on. I know Alberto does the same thing. So when we think about it in those terms, it's absolutely critically important. But when I put on my bureaucratic, fiduciary responsibility as a system leader hat on, it also makes sense because the less that I have to remediate in the early years, or the less that I have to remediate then in the later years. And let me just be very clear. Right now in New York State, to educate a K-12 student, and it should be a pre-K-12 student, but to educate a K-12 student, that investment's about $20,000 a year per student. To incarcerate a teenager in New York State is about $275,000 a year. So let me just make the very financial question. Do you invest now in educating children at a younger age and giving them a really robust start in their educational endeavor? Yes, because if you don't, you're going to pay 4, 5, 6 times that later to incarcerate them. So I think this is a real opportunity, like all of my fellow panel members have said, to reimagine what is public education. It's not an expense. It's not a line item. It's an investment in the very future of who we are as a nation, but who we are as an economy in terms of GDP, tax base, employment. This is all what we do in our nation's public schools. So I think there's a huge role in early education. And don't take my word for it. Look at the research. The research is absolutely unassailable that this is a good investment.
So we're coming to time, but I have 2 questions. I'm going to ask you all. I'm going to ask all 4 of you to respond and be brief in your remarks. And we'd be remiss not to ask Secretary Spellings to kick this off because accountability is her baby. But last year, many states, as you all know, suspended testing requirements, and as we speak now, many districts are asking for the same reprieve, understandably so. But absent any state accountability, potentially could lead to what we once were, the light that President Bush and Secretary Spellings was able to shine on. the soft bigotry of low expectations. I know Margaret knows that very well. What are your thoughts on accountability in the immediate future and certainly in the, let's say next 2 or 3 years? And I'll ask this to be a round robin. We'll go Secretary Spellings, Duncan, Carvalho, and Carranza.
Okay, I'll make it a speed round. Well, first of all, I applaud the need to pause last spring, obviously. And further, I applaud those superintendents and school districts that embraced diagnostic assessment when those students went back to school this fall to the extent they did, online or otherwise. I think it's appropriate, just as we've done in hurricanes and other crises, to not have the full power of our accountability system and our A through F grading systems and those sorts of things around the country this year. But there are some things that we can be accountable for. Where are those 3 million school students that are missing? How are we doing on these other metrics? More input related than I normally would have probably endorsed. One other great thing about technology and education is I think we are on the lip of the cup of perfecting assessment that can be embedded, that's ongoing, that's real time, and that can also have the muscle of accountability. But by God, if we get through this thing with a retreat around the needs of poor and minority students, that will be a huge failure. And you'll have me to contend with.
I think while we're reinventing everything else, to not reinvent accountability would again be a massive lost opportunity. So exactly as Margaret said, much more formative stuff. Let's figure out where kids are, but who's accountable for figuring out how many meals a day kids need? Who's accountable for getting them the mental health services they need? Who's accountable for creating the massive tutoring program to help kids who are 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 15 months behind now? Who's accountable for helping them catch up? We should be looking at stuff after K-12, not just graduation rates. What are college going rates? What are college persistence rates? What are college completion rates? We should be looking at all of these things. And again, we owe it to all our kids. But again, if we're serious about systemic racism, if we're serious about taking this stuff on and not just happy talk, we have to hold ourselves accountable for all of these things across the board. And the final thing I'll say is that we as Democrats are often, again, everyone may not agree, we're often good at asking for increased investment, and it is absolute investment, as Richard has said and said eloquently, but it can't be investment free of no change in results. And we have to ask, for me, the holy grail in education that we've never quite got to is make the right investment, but hold ourselves accountable for transforming kids' lives and giving them a chance to fulfill their God-given potential. That's the trade-off. That's not even trade-off. That's the holy grail that we got to get to.
I'll be very brief. For a long time in America, we've looked at, and I'm very glad that the issue of accountability is being discussed, but for a long time in America, we've looked at academic accountability from a post-mortem lens. At the end of the school year, here's the performance data, here are the letter grades that are assigned to schools, districts, state, et cetera. And I valued that, but I by far appreciate, and part of our practice in Miami-Dade embraces formative evaluation and data. So yes, the fact that we're dealing with a crisis, it does not mean that you cannot get close to 100% of your students through diagnostic assessments to determine where they are today and how much ground have they lost compared to where a similar cohort of those students was a year ago prior to the pandemic. If you don't do that, you cannot have a strategy to actually mitigate their regression. So I appreciate strong, rational accountability systems. We embrace them in Miami-Dade, but I also believe in fewer, better assessments. And I also believe, and I think it's indispensable today, it would be criminal if we didn't do it. I believe in the disaggregation of data in a meaningful way for us to really understand what's happening, not just in a system or in America, but behind the curtain. Because even the highest performing systems have pockets of underperforming students, and we ought to have the courage to actually put a spotlight on it. And without a system of accountability, you don't know where those gaps are. And much like what Secretary Duncan just said, I really do believe that there's more to accountability than academic performance accountability. So the whole issue of food insecurity, home insecurity, access to high quality early childhood education, there ought to be measures by which the federal government recognizes and rewards in a competitive way systems who are willing to actually embrace that level of accountability with the appropriate funding to actually build the systems that protect the most vulnerable in our communities.
So kudos to all of my panelists because my colleagues, because I agree exactly with what they say. I would just say this: it's not about who gets there first, it's about who gets there. So mastery learning is not about you getting there on Monday and getting penalized if you get there on Friday. It's about, have you learned what we want you to learn, and how do we know that you've got there in the first place? So formative assessments are incredibly important, but knowing where our children are also incredibly important. I don't know many students or those who serve those students that go to work every day and say, today I'm going to underserve my kids. Or kids that say, I'm going to go today and just waste time. So think about what we've done in the last 9 months. We haven't suspended kids like we've suspended them. We haven't failed kids like we did in the past. We haven't negatively evaluated teachers by a punitive system like we've done in the past. So what we've done is really gotten back to the grassroots, the true meaning of what education is. What are you trying to do? How are you doing it? And then what do we do to make sure that we get you to master the content knowledge that we need you to have, and then realize what the next steps are? Those are also part, in my very humble perspective, of what we need to do as the new normal post-COVID-19. Let's reimagine how we work public education, knowing that our public education system is becoming much more diverse, much more linguistically diverse, and much more poor in the United States of America. I think that's the role for the federal government, and that's our role as educators.
So the most frequent question we fielded, social media in advance of this webinar this evening was, are any of these four interested in being the next Secretary of Education? And we're so thankful for your leadership, both of our former secretaries and both of our superintendents, and Chancellor Carranza and Superintendent Carvalho. What experience, feel free to offer a ringing endorsement for yourselves or somebody else, but what experience do you believe the next Secretary of Education must have? President-elect Biden has signaled it will be an educator. What experience do you think they need? And we'll start with Superintendent Carvalho, Chancellor Carranza, Secretary Duncan, and Secretary Spellings in that order.
Very briefly, I think the next Secretary of Education needs to have a good understanding of where America has been, where America is today, what the challenges have been, but also what the boundless opportunities lie ahead. Secondly, I do believe that it is time to have an educator as Secretary of Education. I think the next Secretary of Education needs to clearly understand the increasingly diverse perspective, the kaleidoscope of color, of shape, of ability, of birth, of immigration status, of gender, of preference that makes up the student body across the country, and embrace, champion policies that recognize and elevate all. And I think also the next Secretary of Education needs to be someone who is pragmatic, realistic, that is a data-driven person, listens to science, and establishes a fair balance between reasonable accountability and local control over implementation of standards and best education. And I think lastly, the next Secretary of Education needs to be someone like the two secretaries that we have on this panel. Maybe at some point, for they worked for different administrations, they may have disagreed on certain elements, but these are individuals who understand what's best for our country. and pushed hard for policies that benefited students, teachers, and ultimately the economy and the democracy that we need. And I'll close with this. The next secretary needs to recognize that public education is the bedrock of our nation's democracy, period.
Very eloquently stated, Alberto. I would say that there are 4 things for the next Secretary of Education. Number 1, the next Secretary of Education must be committed to dismantling the Jeffersonian model of education. And Thomas Jefferson, although he was one of our founding fathers, very clearly said that education should have 2 tracks, one for the learned and one for the laboring. And if we were lucky, we would be able to rake a few from the laboring into the learned. That's not what education should be, especially public education. So the next Secretary of Education should understand that our educational system should be for all that are learning in our public education system. Number 2, the next Secretary of Education must be someone with classroom experience, principal experience, someone who has walked, talked, and lived the learned experience of educating children in America. Number 3, the next Secretary of Education, from my very humble perspective, should be someone that has a very trauma-informed perspective on what we've all gone through. I don't know anybody that's over 107 years old that has experienced the last pandemic, but we all now have that common experience. So it can't just be about metrics. It can't just be about accountability. It has to be about trauma-informed practices, approaches, curriculum, pedagogy. And I would say the 4th thing is that the next Secretary of Education must be committed to serving all students in our public school systems, and see that serving our public school students is not an expenditure, but an investment in the very future of the democratic nation that we are so proud to call the United States of America.
Yeah, we're looking for somebody who walks on water here. That's unbelievable range of traits. I just want, you're going to get someone who's human and who's going to have some strengths, who's going to have a lot of weaknesses. And I'll just say quickly, for me, the biggest thing is a healer. I think the amount of trauma that people have been through, and particularly that teachers and families and kids have been through, is extraordinary. I want a healer. I want someone who can listen. I want someone who can unify. And again, people like to talk about that's one job. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of important jobs in that administration, in that department, across districts. We haven't talked enough about higher ed here, across the country. You need someone who can manage and build those kinds of broad-based coalitions across the country to try and move us together in a very, very different direction.
I want to stipulate much of that, and it does seem like a couple of people on this call meet the specifications that Richard outlined there. But I would just say that this person needs to have the president's ear and the influence to have him and the vice president use their platform to elevate this issue and to bring us together around the things that we've talked about. So with that, Javed, back to you.
Well, thanks so much to all of you for joining us. A huge thank you to our panelists, Secretary Margaret Spelling, Secretary Arne Duncan, Chancellor Richard Carranza, and Superintendent Alberto Carvalho for a fantastic conversation. Our chat box was overrun. I look forward to engaging on Twitter in the coming days. Patrick, I'm going to turn it back to you for any housekeeping notes on our end.
Great, thank you, Javed, and thank you so much to our panelists. I'll be really brief because I know we're a little over. Please do look out for a recap blog and a video posting of this discussion on our website early next week, and we'll make sure to share that out with everyone. We also have a host of webinars coming up. Please check out our website at hunt-institute.org/upcoming-webinars to find more great discussions like this one. Again, thank you so much to everybody for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.